Thank you very much. I want to take just a minute, if I may, to follow up on Kate's talk by mentioning that I first came to the Naval Academy as a professor. I could hardly believe I was a professor. And walked into my very first classroom there at the Academy, and there were women in the classroom in 1976. And among them was a young woman named Wendy Lawrence, whose father, Bill, I got to know pretty well. And Wendy graduated with the first class of women, 100 women out of 4,000 midshipmen. That's a tough path to walk. But she graduated in 1980 and became a pilot, and a fighter pilot, and an astronaut. So, Kate, the people you talked to us about paved the way for people like Wendy Lawrence. So thank you for that. That was very interesting. I also want to thank my friend John Parshall, who I think set us up beautifully for this whole day by explaining how in 1942, we now look back and we think, well, with hindsight, some 70 years on, it's obviously we're going to win this war. The Allies would prevail, global fascism would be defeated, militarism suppressed. It seems inevitable now. But it did not seem so at the time, and it was extraordinarily useful to be reminded of how precarious, how perilous, to use our term that we're using for this symposium, it was. You think about the Axis triumphs that fell like hammer blows throughout 1940 and 1941. The fall of France, shocking, absolutely shocking. The Dunkirk evacuation, the German U-boat slaughter of Allied shipping in the Atlantic, and after Pearl Harbor, of course, off the American coast. 1941 saw horrifying success by the Wehrmacht in the Soviet Union. And it's difficult now, absent John's presentation, to appreciate how alarming that was. We know now it's all going to be okay. Western allies would recover from those hammer blows. The British would endure and survive. The Russians would turn the war around in the East. The American arsenal of democracy would produce the unimaginable number of ships and tanks and planes and trucks by Studebaker and others that were needed to ensure eventual Axis defeat. But of course, nothing in history is inevitable. History is certainly affected by things like culture, economics, and geography, but in the end, it is made by people. It's what people do at critical moments that determine the course of history, and during the critical and perilous year of 1942, one of those people was Chester W. Nimitz. Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor on the last day of 1941, December 31st, 1941, and arguably the most perilous moment in the Allied cause. And characteristically for him, the moment was markedly low-key. He read his orders aloud, which is the act that actually endowed him with command of the Pacific Fleet, on the deck of a submarine in East Lock, just steps away from his office. It was convenient. Afterward, a reporter asked him about his plans, and no doubt he was hoping that Nimitz would respond with something like, "We have not yet begun to fight," or "Damn the torpedoes." But he didn't get anything like that. Instead, Nimitz thought about it for a few seconds and said, "All we can do is bide our time and look for opportunities that might come along." Not the stuff of headlines, but absolutely a window into who he was. He was the man who, for the next 1,341 days, commanded, directed, and supervised the air and ground, as well as the naval actions of the Allied forces in the largest military theater of the entire war, an expanse of more than 65 million square miles. And at the end of that, he was the man who signed the document ending the war on behalf of the United States government. MacArthur signed it on behalf of the Allied powers, but it was Nimitz who signed for the United States of America. So what was it about Nimitz that made this possible? What personal and professional characteristics allowed him to accomplish this remarkable turnaround? We have all seen books about how to be an effective manager, how to be a successful person. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Admirals, going to be my next book. It goes without saying that he was intelligent, professional, competent, but beyond that, he was, as suggested by his response to the reporter, soft-spoken. He was not given to grandstanding, unlike other individuals we've heard about today. He was likely to spend at least as much time listening as he did talking. He had a puckish sense of humor that he deployed as necessary, often to diffuse tense moments. He was always in complete control of himself, at least publicly. If he ever gave in to his frustrations or depression, no one ever saw it. To use the words of a classmate who described him on his page in the Lucky Bag, the Naval Academy yearbook, if you would, he was calm and steady going. He was encouraging to others. He had a particular talent to instill confidence in other people that they could be successful. You can do it. And he internalized a decision-making tool that he called calculated risk. It's a phrase you bump into a lot when you read his letters and summaries. Now, calculated risk for Nimitz did not actually involve any calculation. There's no formula, there's no algorithm that can produce an answer. It was a process. It was a way of looking at a problem that depended on a commander's subjective evaluation, analysis, judgment, of weighing the potential value of the objective with the cost that it might require to achieve it. So if we wanted to compile a list of Nimitz's command characteristics, here are some. And such a list is useful. But even more useful, since I am an historian and not a political scientist or a management theorist, I think even more important is to take a look at what he did in command. And in this conference, we're going to look at what he did in 1942, that perilous and critical year, how he employed these characteristics at crucial moments. So what I'm going to do with my time here is not to define and expand upon each of those characteristics, but take a look at what he did in 1942. And what that means, of course, is looking at the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, and Guadalcanal. You may have heard of these places already today. Each was not only an important milestone in the war, they also help us appreciate both Nimitz's decision-making and his character. Most of all, they show how he dealt with people, because Nimitz didn't manage the war. Nimitz managed the people who managed the war. And as a longtime friend said of him, he knew how to deal with people. So the Battle of the Coral Sea. It occurred in May of 1942. As you know, it's the first major fleet action of the Pacific War. It is also the first naval battle in history in which the opposing fleets never sighted one another. All the combat took place from carrier-launched aircraft. And it's the first battle of the war in which the Japanese failed to achieve the strategic objective that they had gone out to achieve, which in this case is the capture of Port Moresby on the south coast of New Guinea. Now that much we've already heard today, fairly widely known, understood. Yet the role that Nimitz played in this is sometimes, I think, not fully appreciated. Now, from the moment Nimitz took command on the last day of 1941, he established a protocol with his intelligence officer, the one he had inherited from his predecessor, Eddie Layton, whom he ordered to come into his office every morning at 8 o'clock in advance of the daily staff meeting that took place at 9, and brief him on whatever information he or Joe Rochefort, his close friend in the Hypo Command, had been able to come up with overnight. Well, 3 months into Nimitz's tenure, on April 5th, 1942, Layton came in to say that the cryptanalysts at Station Hypo suspected that the Japanese might be planning an amphibious movement through the Coral Sea aimed at Port Moresby. Rather than coming over the Owen Stanley Mountains on the Kokoda Trail, they would come around the end through the Coral Sea and capture Port Moresby that way. It was no sure thing. At this point, it was a little more than a guess. Hypo, we tend to say, well, they were reading the Japanese mail. No, they weren't. They were getting little bits of information, clues as to what the Japanese might be doing. Moreover, at that time, the Japanese carrier force, the Kido Butai, was still in the Indian Ocean, 5,000 miles away from the Coral Sea. So Nimitz told Layton to keep him updated. And 12 years later, on the 17th, Layton came in to say that the code breakers were now pretty sure that Port Moresby was the next Japanese objective, that the invasion fleet would be accompanied by 3, possibly 4, maybe even 5 aircraft carriers, and it would take place in a few weeks, the last week of April or the first week of May. Well, of course, it's great to have advance information of enemy plans. But what in April of 1942 could Nimitz be expected to do about it? The United States had only 4 carrier task groups in the entire Pacific Ocean. One of them, the Yorktown Group, was in the Coral Sea, so it's well positioned under Frank Jack Fletcher. The Lexington was in Pearl Harbor. It was having 6-inch guns removed to give it more AA ammunition so it could fight off Japanese air attacks. So that was going to have to be completed, and it's still 4,000 miles away from the target place. And the other 2 were off on what was essentially a morale-boosting mission to drop a handful of bombs on 4 Japanese cities and could not possibly get back in time. So here's the dilemma. Should Nimitz try to hurry the Lexington's repairs, send her out as fast as she could go to get down to the Coral Sea to join the Yorktown, and put those 2 carriers, the only 2 available carriers in the Pacific Ocean, in front of 4 or maybe 5 Japanese aircraft carriers for Port Moresby? Was Port Moresby worth it? Here's where you apply calculated risk. To help him decide, Nimitz ordered his staff to prepare an estimate of the situation, listing all the variables. It ran to 36 pages, single-spaced. And after reading and studying it carefully, Nimitz decided to do it, to commit his 2 carriers against the expected Japanese thrust into the Coral Sea. Then he had to convince his boss. For all his growling assertiveness, Admiral Ernest J. King was reluctant to commit the Lexington to the Coral Sea. King had once commanded the Lexington. He loved the Lexington. It's quite a risk to put it out there at the end of a long tether in front of a superior Japanese force. For Port Moresby, Nimitz had to convince him that having advanced knowledge of enemy plans provided just exactly the edge he needed to overcome the odds. So Nimitz ordered work on the Lexington to be completed quickly in double shifts, get her out to the Coral Sea 4,000 miles away as fast as she could go, and join the Yorktown. It was a remarkably bold decision. And again, looking back on it now, we think, well, of course. Right? We knew about it, so of course we put our 2 carriers out there. John Lundstrom, I think, properly calls it a breathtakingly aggressive decision. So we think of Chester Nimitz as the steady hand on the helm, but he could roll the dice when he wanted to. Well, management of the battle fell to a man named Frank Jack Fletcher. And here we get another insight into Nimitz's command style, for in the orders he gave to Fletcher, he did not tell him to stop the invasion, to throw his 2 carriers in front of the Japanese and fight them to the death. Instead, he told them, remember what he said to the reporter, he told him to look for favorable opportunities to weaken the Japanese invasion force. And he left it to Fletcher to determine exactly what constituted a favorable opportunity. The bottom line was that Fletcher was to do what he could to, quoting the orders, assist in checking the further advance of the enemy. And Nimitz did not suggest to Fletcher how he should try to do this. He opened his mind to Fletcher about what he knew, what he suspected, what could be accomplished, what he hoped to be accomplished, gave him all the information he could, expressed confidence in his ability, and sent him on his way. And then he stepped back. Even in the immediate wake of the battle itself, when Fletcher broke radio silence to report the events of May 7th and May 8th in the Coral Sea, Nimitz sent him no orders. He didn't say, stay there and fight it out. He didn't say, withdraw. He said, use your judgment. And he sent congratulations for his glorious achievement. Because after all, Fletcher had done exactly what Nimitz asked of him, checking the further advance of the enemy. The Japanese invasion force, in the wake of the Battle of the Coral Sea, turned around and headed north. Port Moresby never fell to the Japanese. You remember the maps that we've seen on the screen showing the extent of Japanese conquest, and there's a little bump. They never got Port Moresby. But King was unimpressed. Fletcher's forces had sunk 1 small Japanese carrier, while the Japanese had sunk the much larger Lexington, King's beloved Lexington, and King wanted to know why Fletcher had not done more, and in particular why he had not ordered a night destroyer attack against the enemy fleet. Nimitz defended his subordinate, but he did not do it confrontationally. Think about where he is in this chain of command. He's supporting Fletcher here and aye, sirring to Ernest J. King up here. He explained to King that the loss of 81 American aircraft during the battle had significantly weakened the striking capability of Fletcher's 1 remaining carrier. He explained that the distances involved in a carrier battle were too great for destroyers to make it to the target and back again on a single load of fuel, and that the possibility of inflicting more losses on the enemy by continuing the battle was not justified by risking the Yorktown further. Here's another application of calculated risk, but this time Nimitz concluded that the risk exceeded the value of the objective, especially because the Japanese invasion force had turned around. Yet King remains suspicious, perhaps even contemptuous, of Frank Jack Fletcher. And these circumstances required Nimitz to walk a fine line between acknowledging King's disappointment, yes, sir, Admiral, I hear you, I understand, I appreciate it, and supporting his subordinate. Nimitz did not challenge King directly, but neither did he throw Fletcher under the bus. He managed the fallout from both ends in such a way as to assuage King's unhappiness while keeping Fletcher in his job. Now, the second example I'm going to cite is the Battle of Midway. Somebody asked me back here, aren't you going to talk about the Battle of Midway today? Yes, we are, and here it comes. Everyone here knows the Battle of Midway is at least perhaps the critical turning point in the Pacific War. But again, the key role played by Nimitz is sometimes underappreciated. By now, this is late May of 1942. Halsey's 2 carriers have come back from the Doolittle raid. So we've got those two. They had refueled, resupplied, and sped off again into the South Pacific. Far too late for them to join in the defense of Port Moresby, of course, but King feared that the Japanese were about to target both Nauru and Ocean Islands, which they were. And that meant that when Leighton came to Nimitz with news of another Japanese threat, this time to the tiny atoll of Midway, there were no carriers at all in Pearl Harbor. The Lexington, of course, was gone, resting somewhere in the bottom of the Coral Sea. And by the way, most of you may know that her wreck site was discovered only a few years ago in 2018. The Yorktown still floated, but she was limping back to Pearl Harbor with significant structural damage, below the waterline in particular, trailing a 10-mile-long oil slick, and her battle-worthiness was suspect at best. Here's another example of calculated risk. Again, looking back on it, well, of course, we know they're coming. We have an advantage. Let's exploit that. Now, Midway is a valuable target, to be sure, but it's not really existential. Nimitz had two fully operational aircraft carriers left. They were both in the South Pacific, 2,000 miles away. Nimitz wanted to recall them to Pearl Harbor at once. King didn't want to do it. He feared a Japanese move on Nauru and Ocean Islands. He really wanted to protect that line of communication between Hawaii and Australia. So confronted by this dilemma, Nimitz resorted to an uncharacteristically devious gambit. Deviousness, not a word we usually associate with Chester Nimitz, but here's what he did. He sent Halsey an eyes-only message, ordering him to maneuver his task force in such a way as to make sure he was seen by the Japanese. Halsey dutifully steamed north, close to the Japanese base at Tulagi, until a Japanese search plane found him and reported his presence. Once Hypo intercepted that report, Nimitz then ordered Halsey to get back to Pearl Harbor as fast as he could without breaking radio silence and without being seen. Nimitz's objectives here were twofold. First, the news that a powerful American carrier force was in the South Pacific did indeed cause the Japanese to shelve, at least temporarily, turned out to be permanently, their ambition to capture both Nauru and Ocean Islands. But second, and I think to Nimitz more importantly, Nimitz could now report to King that, well, you know what, Admiral Halsey has been discovered by the Japanese, so I had to recall him to Pearl Harbor. And unaware that he'd been conned, King agreed. Well, this gives Nimitz two carriers to confront Japan's approaching 4, maybe even 5. Rochefort's still not sure about that 5th one. But when Halsey reported himself to Nimitz's office, it was obvious that he was in no condition to command them. He had a severe skin disease, probably shingles, we don't know. And Nimitz ordered him to report to the hospital immediately, as soon, that is, as he recommended a replacement. And Halsey at once named the commander of his cruiser-destroyer screen, Raymond Spruance. So now Nimitz had 2 carriers, and he might possibly have 3 if Yorktown got back in time, if it could be patched together in time. And because of Halsey's illness, if Yorktown could participate, Fletcher's seniority would make him the senior officer in charge. And what was King likely to think of that? Both Fletcher and Spruance were black shoes, battleship drivers, ship drivers, not aviators. And they're going to lead 2.5 carriers against 4, maybe 5 Japanese carriers in defense of little Midway Atoll. So again, Nimitz confronted the principle of calculated risk. Nimitz did not know, by the way, part of the equation that was missing is that several hundred miles behind the Japanese carrier force was another Japanese battleship force with Yamamoto himself on board, though I personally doubt if that would have made any difference to the decision that he made. He knew the enemy target. He knew within a day or two the date of the attack. Was that enough to accept uneven odds in battle? Remember that the overall Allied strategic plan for the whole war is to defeat Germany first. Nimitz's job in the Pacific was to hang on long enough for the new construction ships to become available sometime in the summer of 1943. Maybe the smart thing to do here is to let the Japanese have Midway. I mean, it's 4,000 miles from Tokyo. The Japanese would have a hell of a time keeping it supplied. Japanese convoys bringing food and fuel, all the way, bringing fuel from Japan to Midway to fuel the airplanes on its airstrip. Those convoys would be savaged by American submarines. Nimitz also knew that if he did commit his few carriers to a battle for Midway, and he lost one, maybe two, possibly all three, the U.S. Navy, the Hawaiian Islands, maybe even the west coast of the United States would be virtually defenseless. And though he did not know it, sending the American carriers out to defend Midway was exactly what the Japanese wanted him to do. Their real objective in the whole operation was not really Midway, useful as it might be. It was to lure the American carriers out into deep water and sink them there, which would give the Japanese the run of the Pacific for at least a year. But with his advanced knowledge of the Japanese plan, Nimitz saw that he could turn that plan against them. He could pre-position his own carriers, however many that turned out to be, 2, possibly 3, several hundred miles north of Midway, quite literally in the last place the Japanese would look for them. The Japanese hoped to ambush the American carriers, but Nimitz planned to ambush the Japanese. Another factor that played into his risk analysis was that while the Japanese would have more carriers, the island of Midway had an airfield. Nimitz sent everything he could get his hands on that would fly out to that airfield, and assuming that Yorktown could be made ready, that would give him 4 airplane platforms. 4 against 4. So bold as it was, as Nimitz calculated the risk and benefits, it looked to him like he had the advantage. And once again, he told Fletcher, the goal is not to slug it out with the approaching Japanese, but in his words, to be governed by calculated risk. That is, to avoid exposing his force without the prospect of inflicting greater damage on the enemy. If it looked like things were going against us, if we didn't get the jump on them, by all means, turn east and get out of there. Do not risk the carriers. If the Japanese took Midway, don't worry, Nimitz told them, we can always get it back. Well, we know how it worked out. It was a near-run thing, to be sure, but the decisive dive bomber attack at 10:25 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, tilted the war in favor of the Allies. The details of that fight are amazing, and they're certainly worth reading about. But we should not forget that absent Nimitz's careful, thoughtful calculation of risk and reward, it would not have happened at all. There was fallout in terms of personnel of this battle too, successful as it was. Though Fletcher was in overall command, his ship was the one that was attacked by the Japanese, and after being hit several times, the Yorktown finally succumbed to her many wounds and went to the bottom. And because of that, Ray Spruance has garnered most of history's accolades for winning the battle, though Fletcher's role was critical. Still, the loss of the Yorktown did nothing to put Fletcher back into King's good graces. And yet, the more controversial personnel issue after Midway concerned the captain of the USS Hornet, Mark Pete Mitcher. The gaunt and grizzled Mitcher was 56 years old, but as a visitor said of him, he didn't look a day over 80. Mitcher was a veteran aviator, unlike Fletcher, unlike Spruance. Technically, he was Naval Aviator number 33, and yet his entire air group was missing from the Battle of Midway. Afterward, on June 13th, when the Hornet and the Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor, Nimitz learned from Spruance, who became Nimitz's new chief of staff, how badly Mitcher had flubbed the attack. For the morning strike, he had sent his planes in the wrong direction, the famous flight to nowhere. And then in the afternoon, he had defied Spruance's orders by using 1,000-pound bombs instead of 500-pound bombs on the ordnance package of his planes. Then he had launched those planes late and turned the Hornet around when only half of them were in the air so that the other half had to remain on board. And bad as all that was, to Spruance, the nail in the coffin, the one unforgivable thing was that he had concealed all this in his after-action report, which was demonstrably false. Well, what's Nimitz to do about this? No doubt, Nimitz and Spruance discussed this at great length. They used to take a morning walk every day and an afternoon walk every day. And what they talked about, we can never know. There was no tape recorder on either one of them when they made those walks. Yet it must have been decisive. For even though Nimitz had already announced Mitcher's elevation to command the Hornet Task Group, he rescinded that appointment after only 3 days and sent him instead to command the PBY squadron at Kaneohe on the north coast of Oahu. Well, just as interesting as that is what he did not do. He did not challenge Mitcher's false report. He did not expose his behavior to the formal chain of command, though there is some circumstantial evidence that he told King about it privately. So while Mitcher lost his task force command, Nimitz did not discard him. He remained as one of Nimitz's admirals. He invited him regularly to dinner at headquarters, especially when there were other visiting flag officers, to see if there would not come a time when he would prove useful. And of course, as we know, he did. By 1944, Mitcher had worked his way back into Nimitz's good graces and became not only a task force commander, but eventually the commander of all Pacific carriers during the Central Pacific Drive, becoming what his subsequent biographer called the Magnificent Mitcher. Now, my third example of personnel management on the part of Chester Nimitz concerns the long, drawn-out campaign for Guadalcanal, which we've also heard about today. And there was a delicate personnel issue here, too. And this time it concerned this sad-eyed looking fellow. This is Vice Admiral Robert Lee Gormley. Gormley had not been Nimitz's first choice to command the South Pacific area. He had initially nominated Pye, William S. Pye, as battleship commander, but Pye had been vetoed in Washington as being too closely associated with the Japanese surprise attack on December 7th. So Gormley was sent from London, where he had been acting as FDR's personal representative, to Hawaii and then to New Zealand to assume theater command, arriving without a staff in a new theater. And then he had barely arrived when he got orders, initiated by King, to conduct an invasion of the island of Guadalcanal to prevent the Japanese from completing an airstrip there from which Japanese airplanes could have overflown that critical line of communication between Hawaii and Australia. Nimitz certainly recognized the importance of protecting those lines of communication, but he worried a lot about the short fuse King was determined that American forces seize that island before the Japanese completed the airfield, before it became operational. Nimitz did not doubt that the Marines could seize the airstrip if they achieved surprise, but he did worry about sustaining them there afterward. The short fuse, the global and regional shipping problem, which John talked about so eloquently this morning, meant that providing logistical support would be difficult at best and perhaps even fatal. He expressed these concerns to King, but King ordered him and Gormley to go ahead with it anyway. Well, poor Gormley was over his head from the start. King wanted him to set up a headquarters close to the front, so Gormley moved from New Zealand to Noumea in New Caledonia. But the harbor there had only rudimentary loading capabilities, and that greatly complicated an already precarious logistical environment. New Caledonia was also officially French territory, belonged to the Vichy French, and they did not want the Americans to establish a headquarters ashore, as suspicious of the Americans as they were of Hitler, quite frankly. So Gormley set up his headquarters in an old and unair-conditioned Army transport anchored in the harbor. And on top of all of that, you can almost tell it from the slide, he was suffering terribly from infected teeth and gums. He was in pain all the time. With insufficient shipping, limited loading ability, living in uncomfortable quarters, in pain, 24 hours a day, Gormley was miserable. Now that does not excuse the fact that he declined to visit either the rehearsal in the Fijis or the beachhead itself in Guadalcanal. And after the embarrassing defeat of the Allied covering force in Savo Island, most of the American transports were recalled back to Noumea, stranding the Marines in their toehold on the island. They felt, rightly so, abandoned. As Nimitz had predicted, keeping the landing force supplied proved far more difficult than taking the airstrip in the first place. But there's nothing for it now but to do everything possible to sustain them. The question for Nimitz was, is Gormley the guy to do it? King did not think so. King thought that Nimitz was, for lack of a better term, too tender-hearted to get rid of a man, in fact, a good friend, who was overwhelmed by the circumstances in which King had placed him. Gormley had been thrust into a very difficult spot, ordered to conduct a major amphibious operation at the very outset of his command without a staff, with inadequate resources. But to support him, Nimitz badgered both King and the Army to commit more airplanes to Guadalcanal. He radioed King about Guadalcanal, which, as you know, was codenamed Cactus. Let's give Cactus the wherewithal to live up to its name. Kind of a cheerleader for Gormley, if you would. And he also visited Gormley in Noumea, shocked to find the horrible shipping bottleneck there caused by the lack of cargo handling equipment, acted immediately to get that equipment to Noumea, and urged Gormley to go to Guadalcanal to see for himself what needed to be done. Nimitz, as we saw in dealing with Fletcher, was someone who did not like to give specific orders to his subordinates, but he did to Gormley. He noticed that Gormley had sent his only remaining carrier. Recall, only the Hornet was still afloat at this time. And Gormley had sent it out of theater to preserve and protect it, but of course it can't do you any good at Tonga Batu, 1,000 miles away. He sent his cruiser and destroyer force to the southeast of the island, where it was unlikely to encounter elements of the Tokyo Express. That preserved Gormley's resources, but made it impossible for them to be effective. So Nimitz sent him a letter saying, no, recall the Hornet, Please put the cruiser force here instead of there. He never did this before, never did it again, but he did it with Gormley. And in effect, we see Nimitz once again pushing both ways. He pressed the authorities in Washington to supply the material reinforcements that Gormley in fact needed, even as he prodded Gormley to do more with what he had. Nimitz also personally visited Guadalcanal, something Gormley did not do. Arriving in the midst of a driving rainstorm, he spent several days walking the lines with Vandegrift, and when he returned from that trip, he advised Gormley again to make his own visit. Though Nimitz had already decided for himself that the Marines could hold, Vandegrift told him he could if they were supported. But Nimitz now perceived that Gormley was not only over his head, he was suffering physically, suffering mentally from the strain. He actually feared that Gormley might be having a nervous breakdown. This was different from defending Fletcher from King's disapproval or shelving Mitcher after Midway. If he had to relieve Gormley, there would be no disguising the fact that it was for cause, and he agonized over it. "I'm very fond of Gormley," Nimitz wrote to his wife, Catherine, but he knew it had to be done. He radioed Gormley that with Halsey now out of the hospital, in order to take full advantage of his talents and his experience, Halsey would take over command of the South Pacific as soon as practicable. As with Mitcher, he did not throw Gormley away. He met Gormley's airplane when it landed at Oahu, hosted him at dinner that night, and Gormley said to him, "Admiral, why did you feel the need to relieve me?" And Nimitz said, "Bob, I had to choose from every man in the Navy the person best qualified to meet this crisis. Are you that man?" And Gormley said, "Well, no, when you put it that way, I'm not." But they remained friends, and Gormley, after he saw a dentist in the States, came back to the Pacific Theater and became commander of the 14th Naval District, essentially becoming Nimitz's neighbor. So, in examining Nimitz's command of the Pacific Theater in 1942, what we see is not merely his calm steadfastness, his determination, even his bold decision-making in both the Coral Sea and Midway. We see the careful, thoughtful, empathetic, and pragmatic management of the command team that reported to him. In dealing with Fletcher, Halsey, Spruance, Mitcher, Gormley, and with King too, for that matter, as well as with many others, Nimitz was able to harness an eclectic team of individuals to pull more or less in the same direction. There would be other difficult personnel issues from 1943 to 1945. Indeed, dealing with Douglas MacArthur would prove to be a pretty heavy lift by itself. But Nimitz never lost his equanimity, proving what that longtime friend said of him: he knew how to deal with people. Thank you.